Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you, Liam, for organizing this panel. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to the entire UBC Pride Online team. It's quite an honor to be here, particularly because I'm presenting tonight with two scholars whose work has been really important to me. So this is a really enjoyable experience for me so far. My talk tonight is called Liberation on the Dance Floor, and I'm going to be talking about dancing and disco in particular. So here we go. In 1974, Joyce Rock wrote an article in the Toronto-based gay liberation newspaper, The Body Politic, entitled Dykes, Dancing, and Politics. In this article, Rock asks, with some concern, I think, where are the lesbians in Toronto? And her main worry is that Toronto lesbians don't play enough. And playing, for Rock, refers to social and joyful experiences of being together. She writes, quote, "I believe adamantly in the need to play, especially within a context where I may rub elbows with those whose energies and priorities are not identical to mine. Playing," Rock continues, "is essential for the health of collectivity." Ending her article with a question, Rock asks, can those who don't play together politic together? So I take Rock's provocation quite seriously in my work by considering queer collective dance as an important form of play and potentially an important foundation for political action. So today, I argue that the history of queer political action in Canada is one in which collective social dance is vital. And I'm going to build on Rock's article to argue that dance floor experiences are not separate from more sort of conventional forms of political action, but often collective dance is what engenders a desire and a sense of possibility for political action in the first place. The dominant story of gay liberation in North America contends that liberation begins with the Stonewall riots and becomes sort of a uniquely Canadian phenomenon or movement following either the formation of liberation groups like GATE Vancouver, or maybe after the Toronto bathhouse raids of 1981. I think it depends on who's telling the story, but ultimately the conventional tale progresses in a linear march toward gay rights, such as same-sex marriage, bestowed upon citizens by benevolent governmental bodies. And most retellings of this narrative tend to posit the experiences of young, white, middle-class, cisgender men as the primary actors, and tends to posit the spaces they inhabit as the spaces of proper, meaningful politics. And what's more, the story tends to privilege actions that turn to the state to articulate queer political desires within a broader logic of sort of legislative and judicial spheres. So, well, I think Rock's article from 1974 shows us collective dance has long been understood as an important generator of queer collective feeling, right? That said, its function is often cleaved from more conventional histories. So the story goes, there was, on the one hand, gay liberation political organizing, and then on the other hand, underground social dance cultures that offered a sense of escape, perhaps, from the stultifying cultural realities. But by refusing this cleaving and turning instead to the dance floor as a site of political action, I think this encourages some more exciting and complicated questions about both LGBTQ2+ history and contemporary queer, trans, and two-spirit politics. For example, how can feelings of collective pleasure on the dance floor engender desires for a queer world better attuned to difference and solidarity? And what does the heterogeneity of historical music spaces tell us about the cultural composition of and the selective amnesia regarding queer pasts in Canada? Archival collections in Canada are full of evidence of instances where collective dance was a way of intervening in systemic oppression against LGBTQ2+ individuals. So here's some posters, including one in the middle of a dance at UBC that served as a fundraiser for John Damien, who was fired from his job for being gay in 1976. And the fundraiser also went toward GATE Vancouver's really fantastic publication called Gay Tide. Many of these dances served as fundraisers, and the funds raised enabled impressive and diverse activisms. And this is super important. But today, I want to think a little bit more about what these dances did other than raise funds. Because throughout the 1970s, I think queer dance experiences served as political actions in their own right, fostering spaces in which individuals amassed, gleaned a sense of individual and collective agency, and built meaningful connections with others. So in providing marginalized individuals with a sense of belonging and collective power, even just for a few hours, dances have long served as foundational and transformative acts in Canadian gay and lesbian liberation movements. So the political potential of these dances is partly animated by how collective bodies are formed through musical sound. So through embodied participation in specific musical genres, individuals are bound with others in particular ways. So in other words, the political sort of function that I'm trying to like pull out of this history has to do with the specific music played therein and the specific forms of participation that those musics encourage. So I'm focusing today on disco music and disco culture, but I want to be clear that an equally important musical genre that soundtracked gay and lesbian liberation in the 1970s is, of course, women's music. And these are very different musical genres, right? With different sort of sonic ideals and different forms of participation. So when we talk about queer music in history, I think it's important that we really listen closely to the music itself and allow our sort of interactions or interventions in that history to grow from the sound and its effects. So disco, let's talk about disco. Disco is often remembered in the mainstream as quite apolitical, right? As glitzy and glamorous and belonging to the wealthy jet set of Studio 54. But it seems to me that disco is much, much more than that. It seems to me that disco soundtracked gay and lesbian liberation in Canada during the 1970s. This is a genre of music that grows out of Black musical traditions of funk and Philadelphia soul. And then in the mid-1970s is sort of transformed by Latinx musical traditions when a New York-based group called Cell Soul Orchestra dominated the music charts and DJ set lists. Now, I find disco to be a really interesting genre of music because it privileges complicated forms of rhythm and repetition and groove. Most disco music sort of eschews signifiers of temporal and harmonic progress or linearity, right? So conventionally in 20th century popular musical progress is expressed largely through pitch and melody and harmony, but disco doesn't really do that in the same way. Disco emphasizes complex forms of repetition, complex forms of groove, and in doing so, disco provides a sense of sort of rhythmic tension that encourages participants to glean a sense of presentness and to glean a sense of being together on the dance floor. One of the genre's most identifiable techniques is that 4-on-the-floor bass drum. And I wish we were together in a room today so we could be listening to music and dancing to music and really trying to make sense of this. But that 4-on-the-floor bass drum of disco music provides a simple and consistent grounding, welcoming individuals into a collective on the dance floor. And the fact that you don't need a partner to enter the disco dance floor is an important shift in 20th century histories of social dance. Tim Lawrence, who's a dance music historian, argues that participation on the disco dance floor revolves around its status as a collective intensity. And it's precisely this collective intensity that confirms its disruptive sexual intent. So to put this another way, on the disco dance floor, dancers aren't really internally focused on a partnership, but are instead focused on the entire sort of dance floor collective, right? Oops. Cultural theorist Richard Dyer argues in his 1979 article, In Defense of Disco, that disco music and dancing often reflects and produces an expansive sense of marginalized communities' collective power. And Dyer says this is particularly true in the 1970s, when a number of non-commercial discos organized by gay and women's groups flourished in urban spaces. So in Canada, we see many examples of non-commercial dance spaces enlivening gay and lesbian liberation organizing. Liz Millward's book, Making a Scene, Lesbians and Communities Across Canada, 1964 to 1984, gives many, many wonderful examples of this, and even sort of parses the difference between community spaces and more sort of commercial spaces like bars and taverns. But today, I wanted to take you to the East Coast. In January 1976, the Gay Alliance for Equality in Halifax, Nova Scotia, received a special occasion permit for a dance party at 1588 Barrington Street in downtown Halifax. So prior to the GAE's dance party at this location, the gay and lesbian social scene in Halifax was almost non-existent. The few spaces that did exist were under aggressive surveillance by local police and were largely segregated by gender and race and class. Robin Metcalf, who was a founding member of the GAE and is a Nova Scotian queer historian, tells me that gay white men tended to spend their time at a bar called The Club. It was just a very tiny private space that did not have a license. It was only open maybe 1, maybe 2 nights a week. Author and activist Rebecca Rose writes that middle and upper class white lesbians preferred private house parties to public spaces, particularly public spaces that tended to be controlled by cis white gay men. And DJ and GAE volunteer Chris Shepard tells me that most Black lesbians and gay men like himself tended to patronize Black spaces and actively conceal their queerness. So the GAE held their first dance in January 1976, and it was hugely successful, providing a space in which queer individuals in Halifax could come together across forms of difference that previously kept the city's queer scene separated. And meeting minutes immediately after the dance show that even the organizers were sort of surprised and confused by how this went, by how many people turned out and the general feeling of the event. And the dance served as a pretty significant political shift in Halifax, enabling a more pluralistic notion of queerness to take hold in the city. And this is, of course, not to say that the forms of difference that previously kept the queer communities separate or apart disappeared, right? But the turret became a space for this difference to manifest and where they could contest sort of simplistic, homogeneous notions of queerness. Within a few years of opening, the turret made the GAE one of the wealthiest lesbian and gay organizations on the continent. The turret's success, Robin Metcalf tells me, had to do with the unwavering support of Halifax lesbians who claimed a section of the turret and really claimed the space as their own. And I just mentioned this because I think it's such a useful corrective to dominant narratives of both disco and dance music culture, but also Canadian gay liberation in a sort of more broad sense that tend to center cisgender white gay men. So the funds earned from these dances were put to good use. For one thing, the GAE's regular dances meant new and frequent employment opportunities for gays and lesbians in Halifax. And this was 15 years prior to the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act, including protection against discrimination based on sexual orientation. But more so, the funds meant that members of the GAE could participate in national and international political organizing and even host conferences of their own. The turret was a licensed space where members of the GAE worked the door, staffed the canteen, and one of my favorite stories from all of my interviews, before the turret had refrigeration, they would store beer on the roof in the snow. And so volunteers would take turns climbing up a ladder to the roof to get beer that was chilling in the snow. The building's literal turret provided a space for the DJ booth and a large collection of records without separating the DJ from the dancers on the dance floor. And Chris Shepard, who was a regular DJ at the turret in the 1970s, tells me that his work philosophy at the turret was, quote, PARTY. And he explains, quote, I would throw on a song and jump on the dance floor just like everybody else, then rush back to the booth and do it again. So while the GAE's archive holds many exciting and interesting documents, it was this handwritten music request list from the GAE's early years at the turret that really captured my attention and sparked this sort of research focus. The undated document is a list of 34 songs. Most of them are from 76, 77, or early 78. So I suspect the document was written in maybe late 1978, but I'm not positive of that. But I mean, the takeaway here, which admittedly might not be that surprising, is that disco music provided the soundtrack for this space. And this is a fact confirmed by GAE members and DJs that I spoke to. In our interviews, members of the GAE explained to me that the financial success of the turret was hugely important for the organization, of course, but they all talked about it as though it was secondary to the way the dance floor engendered a sense of collectivity and collective agency. For queer individuals in Halifax, the turret's dance floor became a space to come together across the very identity markers that previously kept the scene in the city segregated. And so in this space, music and dancing transformed the burgeoning liberation movement and functioned as a catalyst to manifest and work through heterogeneous notions of queerness. I mean, I think part of this was afforded because of the size of the city of Halifax and the size of the queer community therein, right? In Halifax in the 1970s, the LGBTQ2+ community was not large enough to facilitate queer-oriented commercial or community spaces that were segregated based on identity categories, and unlike other urban spaces. And here I'm thinking of Toronto, which had quite a segregated sort of social scene. Dancing, Robin Metcalf tells me all these years later, quote, brought me back to my body. And for so many people, he notes, dancing at the Turret encouraged a reconnection with their own bodies, a connection that is regularly severed in a homophobic and transphobic reality. But he also talked about the way that it connected him across forms of difference with a broader political collective. So in this space, individuals with different queer subject positions amassed in a collectivity, not of unity, but one of difference. That was really clear because for the years leading up to it, the scene in the city was so segregated, right? And so everybody's talking about how even these like ephemeral and fleeting experiences of being together on the dance floor potentialized broader queer action. In the fall of 1976, for example, Chris Shepard organized a group to confront gay bashers in the city. And he says, a number of us, quote, had just gotten fed up with the whole gay bashing scene in the city. So we put the word out that anybody who is willing and able to stand up and have a fight, let's go do it. So Shepard, who played a leadership role in this endeavor, was one of what he identifies as only a handful of Black GAE volunteers. And he was a regular DJ at the Turret in 75 and 76. And so I think there's an interesting sort of thread of effective responses here, because on the dance floor, Shepard made people feel good, feel safe, feel like they were part of something. And those modes of feeling sort of carried over outside of the dance floor, and in this case, into the streets. As I argued earlier, I think there's a tendency to think of moments of social formation and pleasure on the dance floor as sort of a break from the so-called real work of politics of the same period. But the history of the Turret, I think, challenges some of these simplistic compartmentalizations, right? Because at the Turret, it was disco music and dancing that enabled a diverse notion of queer political organizing and created this sort of effective state that could carry over into other forms of activism. So in this example, music and dance was not secondary to so-called proper queer political organizing. It was the spark. It was the spark that made it possible. Now, I don't want to suggest that the Turret and its dance floor were uncontested or unproblematic or wholly utopian spaces, right? Minutes from the Turret Management Committee meetings indicate that the dance floor saw its fair share of fights and violence. And I found the results of a survey that the GAE did in 1978 that showed some pretty troubling ideas around class and gender and race politics, right? So for example, a few male attendees were quite suspicious of working class lesbians being in the space, right? So there are these sort of tensions that we often see in queer organizing. But these examples of contestation and tension, I don't think is a sign that this is a failed political collective, right? In fact, I think that's part of what makes this political. Musicologist Barry Schenk, in his book, The Political Force of Musical Beauty, argues that a political community does not consist of those who agree on the matters at hand, but instead is made up of those who recognize each other as speaking with legitimate political voices. And ethnomusicologist Luis Manuel Garcia argues that dance floor participation regularly enables what he calls a sense of liquidarity, quote, a slippery togetherness that manages to hold a heterogeneous and unconnected crowd together. And for him, it's really important because what it does is it's a way of absorbing difference without enforcing any sort of homogeneous identity. And here, I think Garcia is using difference in the way that Audre Lorde would use difference, right? That difference does not need to be a detriment to political organizing, but can be quite productive, right? One of Lorde's arguments is that, difference is not the problem. The problem is how we have been taught to understand and interpret our differences from one another. So it's through difference and contestation that homogeneous notions of queerness can be challenged. Robin Metcalf tells me that, despite all the tensions and internal battles and shouting matches, he says, we never lost sight of the fact that the real enemies were not the people next to us on the dance floor. And this comment from Metcalf has really stuck with me, right? He's not saying that, the group ignored racism or sexism or classism or other sort of imbalances of power. He's saying that the discomfort that comes from amassing across difference can often be worthwhile and productive and world-making. So I think it's important in our current moment to sort of return to these histories of queer social dance that can help elucidate for us the way that these events regularly serve to bring disparate bodies together and enable participants to recognize political power. So if we want to explore historical threads that challenge or resist hegemonic narratives of gay and lesbian liberation in Canada, I think we should look to the dance floor. But I realized over the last couple of days as I was preparing this that there's another lesson here as well. So I'll just end with this other lesson that I've sort of come to terms with the last couple of days. As soon as we're able in a post-pandemic world, I think we need to return to the dance floor. And I think we need to situate collective dance across differences of age and race and class and gender and generation and ability as a queer priority. Because I think the political possibilities manifested by historical dance floors should inspire us to return to those musics and the forms of embodied participation that they encourage. And attention to this history also animate what becomes possible in the present and for the future, because as Joyce Rock reminds us in her 1974 article, Dykes, Dancing and Politics, there's great political potential in spaces where music, difference, and play allow us to imagine a radically different world. Thank you.
Hi. Can I ask a question?
Please.
Real quick, what does homogeneous stand for?
Oh, great question. So
you lost me a couple times.
So no, this is a fantastic question. I'm trying to sort through the etymology in my room, but basically it means sameness, right? And so homo meaning same, genius meaning type, maybe. So sort of like same type or all of the same sort of uniformity, right? And so often I think when we look at, this is a great question. So I think when we look at histories of disco, in particular in the States, I mean, there are disco spaces in the States that were forcing homogeneity in the sense that they were only allowing sort of like cisgender white gay dudes into them as like a policy. And so I think there are moments in this history where the sort of like homogeneity or the sameness is being forced, right? And so I think that is not the goal, right? I think that's something that we have to push back on when we're participating in music cultures. And so that's what I was, yeah. And as Amy says in the chat, they say, you know, that was not just in the States. And I don't think it was also just in history either, which I think is an important point to keep in mind, right? There's some really sort of troubling and scary examples of this in history, but I think that these are things that continue either explicitly or implicitly in cultural spaces.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This might not be as much a question as much as just kind of a general statement, but thank you. This was awesome. I'm coming from a different generation, kind of like in between or whatever. But one thing that I kept thinking about as you were talking was about the importance of dance parties and the underground dance parties that people in Vancouver put on like 15, 20 years ago, when it started to be like you could never afford to get a venue anymore and stuff like that. And so there were these collectives that were happening, and I can think of like 3 or 4 offhand that just kind of would take over for a while and put on parties. And it was the thing that you would go to if you weren't really wanting to go to the Odyssey and go to like the gay bars that were fancy, and it was more just like the East Van queers, and it was more open, and it wasn't just like the Odyssey, you couldn't get in the back door if you were a woman kind of thing and stuff. But so these kind of parties were much more open. And then also within like kink community, parties that have dance parties connected to them as opposed to just a play party. And the difference between that in building community is, I think, something that we don't think about enough, and we might not prioritize it because we think, oh, you can go dance anywhere kind of thing. Whereas we can't play everywhere or whatever, but we don't put enough importance into the community creation aspect of that. So thank you.
Thanks. No, Amy, I think you are spot on. And your reference to sort of underground dance communities also has helped me sort of realize the importance of us sort of remembering these underground spaces, and because in so many, I mean, I spend a lot of time in an archive here in Toronto, and so much of what is kept is, of course, evidence of commercial spaces like bars and clubs, right? But it seems like there's a lot missing there when all we do is chronicle or hold on to these memories of commercial spaces and less so of these community spaces, which, as you say, often invite and encourage a whole different crowd and a whole different like way of thinking about queerness. Yeah, thanks. That's really, yeah.
I have one more thing to say.
Great.
I don't know who in this call is from Vancouver, but there is a dance that happens almost every single year called Pride Prom. And I have attended it before, and I just have to say that I have never seen so many queer youth be so comfortable with themselves in a space where they're also so very open with everyone.
Right.
And it's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, that's beautiful, right? That's one of the things it's all for, I suppose. I wonder, are these sorts of things continuing to happen currently? Like, I think Vancouver is in a different moment of this pandemic than maybe the city that I'm currently in, but are these happening either in virtual ways, or are they still happening like physically?
So last year in the summer, it happened online through Zoom. Thank you, Zoom. I'm not sure about this year, but I did hear that it will probably also be online. And the community centers here in Richmond are hopefully planning their own little dances for Pride Month, which will be very nice. So
nice.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, thank you.
Can I jump in with a question or a comment, maybe? Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm in Toronto, and I'm doing some work with the bi community here. I identify as bisexual these days, being queer forever. And, you know, sort of queer spaces, queer bars and queer community groups are not always comfortable places to negotiate or navigate or negotiate sort of access and space as a bisexual member of sort of the larger queer community. Its acceptance often depends on being sort of either male presenting with a male presenting partner or female presenting with a female presenting partner. But I know from the work that we're doing on sort of gathering bi history, in its very early stages, that sort of like bisexual people have always been, you know, involved in organizing and going to different queer spaces. So, you know, I'm curious, are there ways to sort of pull out threads of sort of bi community organizing in the research that you're doing, and also in the archives? Because, you know, we're kind of undertaking some of this work ourselves because we're not finding anything in sort of the more formal queer archives. Yeah. So we're kind of making and researching our own histories. So, so I'm interested in ways to sort of like access that history that I know is there, but, you know, is maybe hidden a little bit.
Yeah, so my immediate thought goes to, in my talk, I referenced this activist and author, Rebecca Rose, who just wrote a book about the Halifax scene called Before the Parade. And she speaks directly to this, right? Because she goes looking for sort of like evidence of bi presence and experience and desires. And what she comes up against is sort of erasure, right? Exactly what you're talking about. And so she sort of thinks about what this means, and she starts talking to more and more elders in the community in Halifax who say, you know, yeah, I'm bi, but it was just like too much trouble to try to like situate myself in this space, right? And so I'm afraid I don't have a very good question, because this is such a good answer, because this is such like a profound sort of erasure in so many of these archives, where it's only legible under certain logics or certain sort of like framings. But I'm excited. What is the name of the project that you're sort of working on, if you don't mind me asking?
So, so I run the Bi Plus Arts Festival. We're just, we're
cool.
a really informal collective of sort of artists, authors, and filmmakers, and we do an arts festival every year. So the project kind of emerged out of that. It's not attached to any sort of like scholarly or research or academic institution. It's really a community-based project. We're looking at getting funding to do actually an arts project, a community quilt, where bi community members can tell sort of an important moment or moments in bisexual history through making a panel that will go into a larger community quilt that we hope to exhibit in 3 years from now. So we're just doing the fundraising for it now, but that's sort of the context that this sort of very informal, but like kind of grassroots work is happening.
Yeah, such important work. I'm just going to put my email in the chat. If you don't mind sending me a message, I would love to sort of talk more about this with you, especially since we're both in Toronto. That would be really, really great. Thank you.
There was a question in chat. What was the name of the project again?
I think that's probably directed at Catherine.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to unmute myself.
Yeah, no, of course.
You'd think after a year of Zoom, I'd get the hang of muting and unmuting. So we just have a Facebook group at the moment. And then we're just organizing through that. But our sort of our larger umbrella group, I guess, is the Bi+ Arts Festival. We're on the web and, you know, Instagram and all of that. So you can reach us through any of those means, Facebook, Twitter, what have you. So that's the best way.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you all so much.
I just had a quick comment. Sorry, I'm going to leave my video off because I feel like I'm not Zoom presentable right now. I'm a Vancouver lesbian and fully believe that a dance floor can be used, and it has been used, to provide these safe spaces for people that maybe don't necessarily have that. And I'm just wondering what you think about, I mean, I've attended a few online dance parties, and it's really hard to match that energy when it's just you in your house, as opposed to you being kind of in a crowd of queer bodies, and being able to let your guard down. And I mean, I live, the only other person that I live with is a queer son, so my house is very queer friendly. But what do you think that means for people who maybe don't have access to a queer safe space? Like how do you think the lack of dance floors in this, like, and who knows when we'll be able to return to that state, the lack of them, you know, what do you see the implications of that being for, say, a queer youth who's living just far away and can't access a safe space and only has the ability to do it online right now?
I think, Harmony, I think that's such a good question and such a sort of complicated question. But I've been thinking about this a lot, right? For one of the things when I was younger and before I was sort of like out to my family, right? One of the greatest things that a queer dance floor did for me was just like provide me with some anonymity where I could just go and be, and I wasn't under surveillance from my family or people that I knew, or there were people, you know, and so that's, I think for a lot of young people right now, that's impossible, right? I've been talking to some of my students at Ryerson who were like young queer students who were living in residence or living in Toronto for a year before the pandemic hit, and now are back living with their parents and are back sort of in the closet, back sort of like hiding their transness. They're like, yeah, it's just so, I mean, obviously the pandemic is horrible for all sorts of reasons, but this one, I'm worried about the sort of like lasting effects of this, because I think you're right that even like, it's really wonderful when there are these sort of online dance spaces or any sort of online ways that we can connect with each other, but I think they're a pretty mediocre version of the real thing. So yeah, I think that's such a great and important thing to think about.
Yeah, I have a couple of friends who, and I appreciate the Vancouver shout outs, because I was like, oh yes, the Odyssey and People's Prom, and there's an online group of a couple of lesbian friends called Babes on Babes, and that was probably the first dance party that I went to, and I was like, yeah, you know what, I feel this, but it's all about, you know, being able to get out of your head and realize that you know, spending time with one another right now that looks like and is structured very differently than before. And we'll just all hope for the best that one day we'll be able to have those spaces again. But thank you for,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation.
Thanks.
Hi, I just kind of wanted to add something as like a member of the dance community, the street dance community, just that I think that I just wanted to maybe also bring attention to like two different dance styles that are actually born through the 70s and 80s, like a style called whacking, which is from the West Coast that was created to disco music. And then I think voguing, which was from the East Coast, which was more house. And I think what's interesting about like what you guys are talking about finding spaces for that, I think that a lot of younger people are actually finding some like solace within those kinds of dance styles that were created from back in the day, and then also kind of reinvigorating that and, you know, holding their own Vogue balls or like teaching classes in those different dance styles that really came from queer people and celebrates queerness. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, that's so great. Thank you, Clarence.